Hello, nerds.
Yat nerds, Donald Syndicate.
Whoa, I haven't been greeted like that on this show before. Welcome, Mark Charles. What did you just say?
Well, I said hello or I am doing well to the people who are called nerds. So
we are called nerds. We are the people called nerds.
Navajo is a descriptive language, and when we heard about this show, I wanted to see if we had any word that we use for nerds, but we couldn't find a very precise fit, and so decided to use nerds Donald Syndicate, which is those who are called by that name, or those who are called nerds. So yeah, right. So that's my greeting here.
I love it. I love it. There's a first time for everything. Hopefully it won't be the last time. But for those who aren't familiar with you, Mark, would it be okay to just get a little bit of introduction to who you are before we get into sort of what you're up to now, like a little bit about your background would be great.
Absolutely. So let me start by introducing myself traditionally. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinashia, Sinbake Dana Nishma, Dr. Higlini Bashis Chin, Sinbake Dana Dasha Che, Dr. Chitni Dashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always give your 4 clans. That's how we identify ourselves. And we're matrilineal, so our identities come from our mother's mother. Now, my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I say, Sinbake Dana Nishma. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Toa Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake Dana. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. So the Piscataway are the nation that resided here. They lived here. They hunted here. They fished here. They raised their families here. They buried their dead here. They were here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are the host people of this land. And I like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of whatever lands I'm on, no matter where I go around the country. And so I want to honor the Piscataway people and thank them for the stewardship of these lands that are now known as Washington, D.C. So I am my name is Mark Charles, as I said before, and I am a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. And I grew up in the Southwest of the United States, in the state of New Mexico. I was born in a border town to the Navajo Nation, which is our reservation, which exists in the Four Corners area. And I went to school there, and then I attended college. I graduated from UCLA with my bachelor's in history. And I've worked both in California as well as back in New Mexico, and ended up pastoring a church in Denver, Colorado, known as the Christian Indian Center. I've also worked as a computer programmer. I like to tell people that I was at UCLA when Al Gore came on campus to invent the internet. And so I was, when I started college, there was no classes going on in computers. There was not with web or internet or anything like that. They called it the information superhighway back then. And it was the year after I graduated that they actually wired the dorms on campus and UCLA was one of the first campuses to be connected to the internet. And I was actually doing some work at the University of New Mexico, and I was working in a student lab there. This was in 1995, I believe it was. And I was in a lab. I was at a computer 6 hours a day, helping people who didn't know how to print and lost their files because they didn't save them. And the internet had literally just come out. Like they had just wired the University of New Mexico where I was. And so I had a connection to the internet, and there were some web pages up, and I looked at the source code for the web pages. I taught myself HTML, and I began writing HTML using a Vi editor, an old Unix Vi editor. And so I kind of got into the internet from the very beginnings of it, and went on to do some active server page development and working with connecting databases to web pages, which back in the late 90s, that was a very novel idea, something that was just beginning to happen. And did some database development for a while, but then actually ended up pastoring a church and worked with the church for a few years and ended up moving back to the Navajo Nation in the early 2000s, and was living there for about 11 years with my family. And that's when I really began, that period of my life is when I began really engaging with the challenges of the history of our nation, and especially the racial challenges that are systemic, not only within the church, but also within the foundations of the country. Began learning about this document known as the Doctrine of Discovery, that is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman, their land is yours to take. This is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. The same document that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. When I lecture, and even in the book I wrote, we started by saying you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal lands inhabited, you can colonize lands inhabited, you cannot discover them. So the fact that this nation refers to Columbus as the discoverer of America, it reveals the implicit racial bias, which is that Native peoples in specific, and peoples of color in general, are not fully human. That doctrine gets embedded into the foundations of the nation. So 30 lines in our Declaration of Independence, after it starts with these very inclusive term of all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution, which begins with the words, we the people, Article 1, Section 2, defining who is and who is not a part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by the Constitution. It never mentions women. It specifically excludes natives, and it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So this doctrine of discovery, this dehumanizing doctrine, gets embedded into the foundations of this nation and actually becomes in 1823 the legal precedent for land titles, which is some of the challenges we're facing today as we're dealing with this systemic and institutionalized white supremacy and racism. These things go back to our foundations and how this nation was founded and the values it was founded upon. And so a lot of what I'm doing today is trying to not only initiate dialogue around this history and around these issues of racism and white supremacy and sexism, but then what do we need to do as a nation to begin to overcome them? And that is why I'm running for president, is because I have some ideas that I think we should begin implementing as a nation to actually begin removing the racism, the sexism, the white supremacy that are in our foundations, so that we can actually create a space where for the very first time, we the people actually means all the people.
I cannot wait to dive into some of the proposals you have, Mark. Before we go there, I would love to ask you some follow-up questions about your background and your early life.
Absolutely.
So for history, did you focus, I'm guessing, American history or
I studied some American history, and I studied some religious history. So I studied the history of Islam. I studied some of the history of both the Jewish and the Christian faith, and I studied some American history. And one of the things I liked about history that really intrigued me about that area of study was there weren't any definitive answers. Like, you could basically argue not whatever you wanted, but you could look at the facts, you could look at the context, and you could build an argument, even if no one's ever made that argument before. But if you were able to kind of put the pieces together and construct an argument, you could make a case for something that had never really even been looked at before. And that's a lot of what I've been doing in my work. And in the book that the book I published about 7 months ago is called Unsettling Truths: The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. And that very much is a building of an argument around U.S. history that most people have never really considered or thought of before. But we put the pieces together in that book that really is eye-opening for how was our nation put together, and what are the things that we value, and how does this impact the world we're living in today.
So tell me a little bit, did you study, when you studied religion, did you touch, and history, did you touch on any Native American history and religion, or was that not in the curriculum at the time? Or?
Well, it wasn't in the curriculum, but what I did, and one of the things I got better at as I was in school. So my junior and senior year of school, I actually realized a lot of the things I wanted to study was not either taught at UCLA or I wanted something more specialized. And so I did a year-long independent study on the Navajo perception of time and how that impacts students coming off the reservation and studying in four-year universities. I did another independent study on the creation story of our Navajo people. And was there any way that how did that go along with some of what people would say was our history and the migratory routes we took? I satisfied my foreign language requirement, not at UCLA, but at the University of New Mexico. And I studied Navajo there and then transferred those credits back to UCLA to satisfy my foreign language requirement. So the longer I was in school, I was in school for 5 years. And as I realized it didn't have all the things I wanted to study, I was able to create some of the classes I wanted to, so I could actually learn the things I really was curious about and the things that were very intriguing to me. So
yeah, that sounds like you took full advantage of that university experience. That's great. Is it true that, I might be ignorant because of maybe perceptions that I've acquired over the years. Is it true that the Native American history is often not written down, that it's an oral history that's passed down from generation?
Yeah, it is an oral history. And so it's been passed down generation to generation. And so this is one of the challenges that we have, as this land was colonized. And of course, and this even goes back to the differences in perceptions of time, where most Native cultures have a more circular perception of time. Western culture has a very linear perception of time. It's not that one's right or one's wrong, one's good or one's bad. They're different, and they cause you to interact with the world differently depending on how you perceive time. And so with a linear perception of time, your written history and your understanding of a progression of history is very important. With a circular perception of time and understanding that things come back around again, it changes the way you interact with history, and it changes the way you even understand. And so the oral and the storytelling of an oral history is treated differently than you would with a more linear history that we have in most Western countries or most Western cultures. So this is why I actually designed a class where I looked at our creation story, which was an oral history, which was later written down in some different formats. And I wanted to examine some of that and see, is there any way we can line that up with what some people would call some of the written history, and how did the two, were there any ways that they factored together or that they kind of interacted or were interconnected between the two? So yeah, there's a lot of things within the Navajo culture that, because our history was oral, and because, as you would say, we lost the wars, and history is written by the victors, much of, not only is the ancient history, the oral history, not known by most Americans, even the written history is very far off base and not at all accurate to what the history actually was. And one of the primary examples is Abraham Lincoln, who is held up as one of the greatest presidents this nation has ever seen. But when you actually go back and read his speeches and look at his legacy, he was a blatant white supremacist who was intent on institutionalizing racism and was interested in constitutionally protecting the institution of slavery. And he was one of the most genocidal presidents in the history of this country. After, in 1862, signing the Pacific Railway Act, which provided the land and the resource to complete the Transcontinental Railway, within 2.5 years of signing that bill, after the Dakota War of 1862, the hanging of the Dakota 38, after the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, after the Long Walk and the removal of the Navajo and Mescalero Apache from the Southwest, Abraham Lincoln had literally ethnically cleansed the states of Minnesota, the state of Colorado, and the territory of New Mexico of Native peoples to make way for 3 of the primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway, making him one of the most genocidal presidents our nation has ever seen. And yet we hold him up as a hero. And
yeah, What do you say, Mark, to people who might argue that, well, if you go back into the 1800s, people were just pretty ignorant at that time, and they uh, believed that people of different races were not equal, and it's not necessarily fair to say that Lincoln, was some terrible kind of evil figure, but he was just a product of his time. Do you buy that argument, or do you feel?
Well, Hitler actually studied the policies of Lincoln to do what he did to the Jews during the Holocaust. Some of the practices that Lincoln enacted, and they affect us today. As I said, if you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln said things like, I have no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes nor allowing them to hold office. There's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two from living in terms of social and political equality. But as long as they have to remain together, there must be a difference. And I, as much as any other man, believe that the superior position belongs to the white race. He was a blatant white supremacist. In his inauguration address in 1861, he supported what was called the Corwin Amendment. It was passed by the U.S. Senate the morning of his inauguration as a way to kind of stop the secession of states from the South, from the United States. The Senate passed the Corwin Amendment, which constitutionally protected slavery in states where it already existed. And Abraham Lincoln voiced his support of that amendment in his inauguration address. Now, it never got ratified, but he absolutely supported it. At the Lincoln Memorial, there is a quote hanging on the wall. There's a museum at the base of the memorial. And what it states is it says, I would save the Union. This is a quote by Lincoln. It says, my primary object in this struggle is not to save or destroy slavery, it's to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. There's a quote hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Abraham Lincoln, Black lives don't matter. Now, he was interested in institutionalizing white supremacy and constitutionally protecting slavery. His legacy is the 13th Amendment, correct? Which abolishes slavery, most people think. But if you read the 13th Amendment, what it states is it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their. So the 13th Amendment does not abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And so today, what do we have happening around the nation? The criminal justice system, we have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. And we incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate we incarcerate white people. We just saw the lynching, the public lynching of George Floyd a month ago in Minneapolis. By who? The criminal justice system, the police force. This is the challenges that we're facing. And so we have both President Biden, our Vice President Biden, and President Trump, who are suggesting ways to reform our policing and reform our criminal justice system. They're saying we should ban certain chokeholds. They're saying we should teach them to our officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. They're suggesting we should, there's proposals or ideas to defund the police, which is rethinking how we do policing. And I'm out on the campaign trail saying, if we want to reform our criminal justice system, the first step we have to take is we have to abolish slavery. We have to remove this institutionalized white supremacy and this constitutional protection for this abhorrent practice known as slavery that exists due to the clause in the 13th Amendment.
What would you do with people who are convicted of a crime?
Well, they can still be incarcerated, but we're not going to legalize slavery. Right now, we have a school to prison pipeline. We have for-profit prisons. We have a whole prison industrial complex that is making millions and millions of dollars off of incarcerated citizens. The reason we do this is because slavery is constitutionally protected within our Constitution. So if we want to change that system, we have to address it at the root. We can't just change a law up here. If you live in a house, right, and you have a bad foundation, so your walls are cracking, your windows are gaping, your floor is sagging. Now you can argue all you want about what color to paint your walls, what kind of caulking to use on your windows, or what kind of carpet to put on the floor. But until you fix the foundation, you're never going to fix the house. And so we can argue about the things up here all we want, but until we address what's been embedded and encoded into our foundations, we're never going to fix the problems. And this is the challenge, is we've never gone back to fix the problems that are embedded into our foundation.
No, that's some heavy stuff there. And I certainly agree with you. When I've looked at the statistics on US versus other countries' incarceration rates, it's stunning that the land of the free, has such a high percentage of incarcerated people. I also noticed that the recidivism rate and the probability of being arrested was high for African-American males, but also very high for Native Americans.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering, you don't hear about that very often. What's going on there? What do you think? I've always had this impression that Native Americans kind of are able to sort of stay, in their own areas, and the police kind of don't really mess with the Native American areas, but it sounds like that's maybe not true.
So one of the challenges we face is there are three groups of people that are specifically excluded from the Constitution: women, Native peoples, and African people. Those are the three groups. Now, then there's also an implicit bias that white landowning men, and technically it's white landowning heterosexual Christian men, are superior above everybody else. But there are these three exclusions of women, of Natives, and of African people from the Constitution. And so these are the three groups that you see the most heavily oppressed. Now, the way race was constructed, so race is not a genetic difference. There's no real genetic difference of race. Race is a human construct. And the way race was constructed in the US was based on the role of the people from that demographic. So the Black race was constructed in part through what's called the one drop rule. So the one drop rule states that you have a single drop of African blood, you're Black. Now, why do we have this rule? Well, because African people were enslaved. They were the labor force. So a one drop rule allowed a white slave owner to rape one of his female enslaved people and produce more babies that he could enslave. So this multiplied that demographic, that population, because they wanted more people that they could enslave. The Native American race was constructed through what's called the blood quantum rule. Blood quantum rule states that your race can be bred out of you. So you're, depending on who you marry, you're half, you're full, then you're half, you're a quarter, you're eighth, a 16th, and then your nativeness is bred out of existence. Why? Well, because the government had treaty obligations to Native peoples. The mythology of this country is that we discovered these lands. There were no people here. So they want the fewest number of Native peoples possible. So they constructed our race not to multiply us, but to breed us out of existence. And so because of that, because we have a growing demographic of Black Americans, African Americans, and a diminishing demographic of Native peoples, because so the nation has dealt more publicly, visibly, with the racial dynamics between the white and the Black races. It has not dealt with the dynamics between Native races. And so even though the injustice is oftentimes very similar, and in some cases it's even worse against Native people than against African Americans, but the nation has never, it's dealt with the Native issue by pushing things off to the side. So we've been moved off of reservations. A lot of people will tell me, well, I don't know of any Native people. I've never dealt with Native issues because there's none living in my area. And I say, yeah, that was by design. this nation was constructed in a way so you would never have to deal with the people who are ethnically cleansed and removed from the lands where your house now sits. Because that would just be too uncomfortable, correct? If you had to know that there were still people who were ethnically cleansed from the land where your house sits, that's an uncomfortable feeling. And so we pushed Native Americans to the side, we pushed them to the margins, we pushed them onto reservations and tried to forget about them. And so the nation has worked very hard to desensitize itself to the history against African people, against African Americans. And it has worked hard to reduce the injustice against African Americans and boil it down to simply it was labor that was stolen. Like that, it's worked very hard to reduce that injustice down to simply the stealing of labor, which is, yes, labor was stolen, but we also had an entire race of people who were dehumanized and who were considered to be less than human, which has all these other implications on it. And the country doesn't want to have that conversation. It may address some of the issues of the stolen labor, but it doesn't want to deal with the other parts. And for Native peoples, again, this country was ethnically cleansed. Genocide was enacted. That's how this nation was born. And the country doesn't know how to deal with that. It doesn't know what to do with that. And so natives are pushed off to the side. So in 1823, there was a Supreme Court case of Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same piece of land from the government. They want to know who owned it. Case goes all the way to the court, the Supreme Court. The court has to determine the principle for land titles. Who had the right to sell the land, the tribe or the government? They rule that title is based on discovery. And that because natives are savages, we are merely occupants of the land, while Europeans who are fully human have the right of discovery to the land, the fee title, so they are the true title holders. That case in 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh, creates the legal precedent for land titles. That precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. I did a TEDx talk 2 years ago on it's titled "We the People, the Three Most Misunderstood Words in U.S. History." And I go through these two cases, the 1823 and the 2005 case. I lay out how they are blatantly white supremacists. And they end up ruling that natives do not have sovereignty over our lands because of the fact that we are savages, both in 1823 and in 2005. And then I'll actually spoil this for your listeners here, because at the end, I reveal who wrote the 2005 opinion that I identify as one of the most white supremacist opinions written in my lifetime, and it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why? Isn't she the voice of dissent on this very conservative Supreme Court? Isn't she the person fighting for the least and all these other things we have about? Yes, she is. But when it comes down to land titles, because land titles are based on the legal classification of natives as savages, when land titles are in question, white supremacy becomes a bipartisan value. And so this is why we the people has never meant all the people. When our Constitution was written, we the people did not mean all the people. In 2020, we the people does not mean all the people. If it did, it would change fundamentally how land titles operate.
Mark, if I recall my elementary school history class long time ago, my recollection is there was an argument that the land of the Native Americans was purchased through treaties. And, you know, maybe the deals weren't great, but they were kind of legally agreed to. Do you buy any of that, or do you think that's just kind of made up stories to justify?
No, there were absolutely treaties, and they were all broken. The U.S. has not honored its treaties. Even though the Constitution states that treaties are the supreme law of the land, the United States of America has not honored its treaties with Native peoples.
Oh, so the deals were struck, and then the government sort of backed out and didn't follow through.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. So then do you have standing? Is there a way to challenge and say, hey, we've been harmed. We want reparations. We want to be compensated for the breaching of these agreements by the U.S. government?
Well, again, this is the problem. First of all, who's going to hold the U.S. accountable? Certainly not the United Nations. No other nation is going to do that. And it's not in the U.S. interest to honor these treaties. This is why, again, as recently as 2005, we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg writing a legal opinion for the Supreme Court, essentially calling Native savages and saying you don't have title to your land. Mm. This is why these injustices this nation continues to perpetuate these injustices because that's all that it has to stand on. And so this is where one of the primary planks of my platform is I am advocating for the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Reconciliation, though, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which isn't accurate. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation. So conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. If reconciliation perpetuates the myth, we used to be great, now we're not, conciliation gives us a much more honest starting point. This thing began as a mess, we're just trying to make it better. And so, yeah, there are a lot of things as a nation, including our history of enslavement, including our history of ethnic cleansing and genocide, including the way we set up land titles, including all the things that are feeding into the injustices that we are seeing today, that we need to find a way to talk about because we've never dealt with them. So in 2000, in his final State of the Union, President Obama, right, our nation's first Black president, he's giving his State of the Union, and he is kind of, I don't know if lamenting, it might be too strong a word, but he's acknowledging that there was a lot of division during his 8 years in office. And he's exhorting our nation to find a new politic. And in his words, he references the Constitution. He says, we the people. Our Constitution began with these three simple words. Words we've come to recognize mean all the people. Now, that sounds beautiful. And he got a lot of applause for that line. But as I sat in my home listening to him, I asked myself, having studied this history, having lived on our reservation, having participated in our nation, and I said, when did we decide we the people means all the people? The founding fathers did not believe we the people meant all the people. Abraham Lincoln did not believe we the people meant all the people. As good as the civil rights movement was, it did not get us to we the people meaning all the people. President Trump does not believe we the people means all the people. The challenge is we as a nation have never collectively decided that we now want to be a place where we the people includes everybody. And this is what my campaign is about. I am calling the question. If you're in a board meeting, right, and you're debating something back and forth for a long time and you're not going anywhere, finally someone will call the question. We're going to vote on this. I want our nation to decide. Do we want to be a place where we the people means all the people? If we do, we have to work on our foundations.
And what would you...
If we don't, then elect Trump, elect Biden. It doesn't really care because neither one of them are advocating for the fact that we have to deal with our foundations because we the people doesn't include everybody.
What are some specific things that you would want to see done to mend the foundations?
So I actually just released last week my first 100 days plan, my first 100 days in office. What do I intend to do? A few years ago, I went through and I read the Constitution from the preamble down to the 27th Amendment. I was expecting to find some racist and some white supremacist language in there. But the more I read it, the more appalled I became. Yes, there's absolutely racist and sexist language, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the exclusion of natives. But there's incredibly sexist language. I began counting, it was so frequent. There are 51 gender-specific male pronouns used throughout the Constitution. There's not a single female pronoun in the entire document who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by this Constitution. Again, in our 13th Amendment, we have a clause keeping slavery legal in prison. We have another clause in the 14th Amendment that keeps the criminal justice system as the gatekeeper for civil rights. And so as I went through it, I actually downloaded the text of the Constitution onto my computer. And rather than amending it, I began going through it with a strike-through font. So every time I came across a gender-specific male pronoun, I put a strike-through font through it, and I replaced it with a gender-neutral pronoun or a proper noun. He, him, or his became they, them, or theirs, or became the president, the senator, whoever else, whatever proper noun I could find. And then I strike through font through the clause in the 13th Amendment, strike through font through the Three-Fifths Compromise. So it's great that we can amend our Constitution, but you still have to read through this incredibly racist, sexist, and white supremacist document to get to the end to realize, oh, this meant that, and this now means this. So I said, let's just edit it. I didn't change checks and balances. I didn't change balance of powers. I merely removed the racist, sexist, and white supremacist language. Now, as I've been talking about this document for the past decade of my life, I've realized that most Americans don't even know that language is there. They actually think we abolished slavery. They actually think that it's inclusive of all genders and all peoples. And they're kind of surprised when they're not. I've tweeted several times. I said, if you think the United States Constitution was written to protect everybody, I said, invite a woman, an African American, and a Native American onto a Zoom call and read the Constitution out loud in front of them. You will be embarrassed at how exclusive and how white supremacist, racist, and sexist this document is. And so my proposal for my first 100 days in office is I want to present these edits to our Congress as edits we need to make into our Constitution. I would like to see Congress pass them. I'd like to see them go out and be ratified by the states. And I believe that in our first 100 days, we can do some major foundational level works to our founding documents to remove the blatant racism, sexism, and white supremacy. And then we can actually get onto other conversations that we have to have, whether it's about universal healthcare or universal basic income or other things like that. But until we fix the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy in our foundations, we're never going to be able to apply these other policies in a way that's equitable or fair. Because the foundations weren't set up to protect myself as a Navajo man or even anyone other person of color or woman or anyone else from the margins.
What would you say
to protect white landowning men?
Mark, what would you say to people who are listening and they might agree with you? They might say, you know what, I bet if we read the document in detail, there's probably tons of for sure sexist and racist either biases in there or just outright statements. But, it's 2020. We have a lot of other problems. Like it's some old document that everybody knows, like, how the government works. It's not like we use the Constitution in a literal sense, all the time. It's kind of underpinning how our government works, but it's not like someone reads the document and then says, oh, because it's all male pronouns, I'm going to purposely suppress women's voices in this day and age. Do you ever get that criticism that like, well, that's so long ago, like whatever, it's an old.
Well, first of all, it's not. I mean, the Constitution is the basis of U.S. law. And so the Supreme Court, whenever a case comes to the Supreme Court, their job is to decide, is this constitutional or not? So the Constitution is constantly being read. It's constantly being used to form the basis of law in the United States. And when you challenge the constitutionality of something, that is what the Supreme Court is there for. The Constitution is the basis of U.S. law. And so again, and then when you look at what do we struggle with as a nation, we have mass incarceration. We incarcerate people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate we incarcerate white people. We have astronomical rates of people of color, especially Black and Native men, being killed by our police forces. We have women earning 70 cents to the dollar. We just, in 2020, January of 2020, Virginia ratified the ERA. The ERA constitutionally advocates or states the equality of women in our Constitution. There was an amendment that was proposed and passed by Congress in 1970. The 38th state to ratify it was Virginia in 2020. But since that time, 5 other states have dropped the ratification of that. And they put a sunset date on it, which was sometime back in the 70s, 2 decades ago. And so we can't even decide in 2020 that we want women to be considered equal under the law.
So let's say, as an example, all of your proposed edits to the Constitution were made. What would change after that? Like, how would that change?
It wouldn't change anything overnight. Again, this isn't some magic fix that's going to change everything. But what it does is it gives us a basis where now the foundations of the country state there is equality and there is equity. The problem is right now, our foundations don't state these things. And so if you want to know why corporations can make massive profits and exploit the environment and have no concern for their employees, or we have to have specific laws to protect the environment, while a corporation can be sued because they're not returning profits for their shareholders. The reasons is because of our foundations, because of what was written into our Constitution, because of the implicit bias that exists there and still exists when you read through the document. And so these are the things, again, if we want to change, if we want to make the changes that, and I followed the 2020 Democratic primary very closely. In fact, I was with the candidates at a few events. There was a forum in August called the Frank Lemire Native American Presidential Forum. And about 10 of the Democratic candidates were there. I was there as an independent, and there was maybe one Republican that showed up. So Elizabeth Warren was there, Bernie Sanders was there, Kamala Harris was there. I don't believe Andrew Yang came to that one. Julian Costa was there, Marianne Williamson was there, I was there. And so I followed the campaign of all of the Democratic candidates. I've heard the arguments for Medicare for all and universal basic income and all the things they're advocating for. But because none of them were talking about changing the foundations, they weren't going to be able to get there. And let me just give you one example from Indian country, from Native America. So there's a crisis going on in Native America known as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I'm wearing my hair tie, my traditional bun, my siye, in red yarn. It's tied in red yarn to remind myself of this crisis known as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, where we have hundreds, thousands of Indigenous women and girls who've been reported missing by their families. They've been reported as having been murdered. And not only have their cases not been closed, oftentimes they've never even been opened. Like literally, many times the families are left to go and search for their daughters and their wives and their nieces alone without help from the authorities. And it's a crisis going on. And so at this forum, this crisis was discussed, and all of the candidates had to give their response. What would they do? Now, almost all the Democratic candidates said something to the effect that they would propose this new law or enact this new policy to protect this very vulnerable demographic. But what I'm saying is, when your Declaration of Independence refers to natives as savages, and your Constitution never mentions women, perhaps you shouldn't be surprised when your Indigenous women go missing or get murdered and society doesn't care. A new law isn't going to fix this. This is a problem with the foundation. We need a new basis for our laws. And so the same thing with whether it's I talked with a lot of Bernie supporters about Medicare for all. Had Senator Sanders stayed in the race, had he been able to win the nomination, had he been able to get elected, and had he been able to get Congress to pass Medicare for all, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Without dealing with the racist, the sexist, and the white supremacist language in the Constitution. What we would have had is great health care for white men, and everyone else would have received a hodgepodge, right? Women's reproductive health would have been dependent upon who happened to be in office, correct? Because the way nothing gets applied equally across the board. That's not the way this nation works.
What about a basic income? That didn't have any strings attached, other than you only had to be a citizen and an adult.
So again, I was very intrigued by Andrew Yang's universal basic income. It deeply intrigued me. I liked how he was thinking outside the box, and I liked how he was addressing some of the problems we have with these large corporations, where because of technology, because of automation, jobs are being lost, right? Mm-hmm. And so universal basic income is meant to address the fact that not only are these jobs going away, but we need a way to provide for people when there's actually less jobs available, and we need to, there's not as lucrative jobs. So we need a way to provide for everybody so we can survive. I liked his thinking outside the box. One of the things I would say I found challenging, and again, this goes back not as much to the wording of the Constitution as much as to the context and the understanding of the doctrine of discovery. So the doctrine of discovery is all about exploitation and profit. That's what's articulated in this doctrine of discovery that gets embedded into our foundation. And so what it sets for as the values of our Constitution is there's no value for life at any level in the Constitution. That's not what our Constitution argues about. The assumption is that these things exist so you can exploit and profit from them. And so this is why today we have corporations exploiting the environment, exploiting the workforce. You have people from the 1% making billions of dollars, driving corporations into the ground and people into unemployment. And they're still able to profit from these things. Now, while universal basic income addresses some ways that corporations can be more responsible, and as a nation we can be more responsible in making sure people have money to eat and to pay rent and to live by, it doesn't deal with the issue of this underlying implicit value for exploitation and profit, which is what's killing not only our country, but it's killing the environment globally. If the entire world were to live like the average American, right? That's not sustainable.
Yeah.
That's not sustainable. So we have right now, we have a group of people living up here, and we have a bunch of people living down here. And most thinking is we have to get people up to here. No, up here is not sustainable. And getting up here requires the oppression of people down here. So yes, we have to move people from the bottom up higher, but we have to do a lot of work to move this other group down here to a place that's sustainable, relationally, environmentally, economically, politically, all these different things. And so I liked how universal basic income brings this group up, I think, to a livable level, but it doesn't address bringing this group down. And so this is where we have to have a discussion, not only about a universal basic income, but what are we doing about these corporations that are making hundreds of billions of dollars through the exploitation and profit and destruction of our people and our environment. And so this is where I was very intrigued by Andrew. I thought he had some great ideas. I would love to, if we're going to be honest here, if I do get elected, I am already considering Andrew Yang for a cabinet position, because I think he would be a very interesting voice to have around my administration about some of these issues. And so, yeah, I've found myself very intrigued by Andrew Yang, and kind of I love the perspective he brought into the discussion, especially around the economy and his ideas around universal basic income.
Yeah, I would love to see that as well. And my sense is that he's a very fresh thinker who's willing to look at problems, not necessarily through the Democratic or Republican lens, but just through a kind of problem solver, outside the box type thinker. I would be remiss, Mark, if we didn't talk a little bit about the environment. I am heavily influenced by growing up in America through, consumption of media and entertainment. But I think one of the positive things I've assumed is that Native Americans have a certain reverence for the environment and for the land. And I'm curious, what's your read on how the trajectory we're on, and what, if anything, we should be doing about how man deals with the environment?
Again, because of our underlying doctrine of discovery, because of the way our Constitution is framed, because of the implicit and explicit values of our foundations, our country doesn't know how to care for the environment. I loved what happened at Standing Rock a few years ago, where hundreds of tribes, tens of thousands of Native peoples came together and in a unified voice, committed to the teachings of our elders, committed to peaceful protest, to prayer, and to ceremony. We tried to communicate to our colonizers, to this nation, that water is life. You can't drink oil. And it was a great step of the indigenous hosts of Turtle Island stepping into our role as the host peoples of this land. Now, when we look at environmental issues, and I think there's a lot that the Native nations of Turtle Island have to teach this country about sustainable living and caring for the environment, and even an understanding of what's the sacredness of these lands here. One of the challenges I see from both the left and the right is that both sides are centering the economy. So you have President Trump and the Republican Party bragging that they have built the most prosperous economy in the history of our nation. And they're doing it at the direct expense of the environment. They're reducing regulations, they're passing more drilling and all. I mean, they're doing it at the exact expense of the environment. On the other side, you have the left that's talking about their Green New Deal. And their message is that we can have a prosperous economy while we save the environment. And so they're trying to save the environment, but they're still promising a prosperous economy. As president, I am not going to promise our nation that we can prosper economically while we deal with this environmental tipping point that we are very quickly coming up to. And I think if we can be honest with the American people and prepare them that we may have to make some very difficult choices coming up, we can actually get something done. When we had it was literally last January and February that President Trump was bragging that he had the greatest economy ever built. We had 11 years of a bull market. Corporate profits were at an all-time high, unemployment at an all-time low. You would think if there was any point in American history that our economy would be able to sustain itself during a global pandemic, it would have been in March of 2020, right? And it took 5 days, let me correct that, 5 days for this economy to come crashing down. It wasn't sustainable. The jobs weren't real jobs. It was a gig economy jobs. Healthcare was in the basement. It was a mess. It took 5 days for this entire house of cards to come crumbling down. And now we've added trillions and trillions of dollars of debt to try to prop up this economy that wasn't working in the first place. One of the things I loved about Gen Z, and this was a year and a half ago, is they organized a global climate strike. Not a protest, a strike. What does a strike mean? A strike means you forgo immediate prosperity for the sake of future survival. When you strike, you give up pay, you give up security, you give up things so that you can have something sustainable in the future. Gen Z gets it. Yes, can the Green New Deal work? Maybe. Can we have a prosperous economy while we save the environment? Maybe. But if we promise our nation that we will prosper while we try to save the environment, and if we get to the point where we have to make tough choices that will actually reduce our prosperity, if we've been selling all along that this is going to be a prosperous endeavor, how do you think we're going to decide when it comes where the rubber hits the road? We're not going to make the tough choices. So as a candidate for president, I am telling people I am absolutely convinced we have to deal with the environment. And I want to take up the mantra of Gen Z, which is we have to treat this as the global crisis that it is. And we have to even be prepared to make some very difficult choices today so that we can have a sustainable world to live in tomorrow. And not just for our children, our children's children, but for 7 generations ahead of us. Our children's grandchildren's 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 grandchildren. That's
right
what
on.
we need to be thinking.
I also want to, I know we're running short on time. I wanted to ask 2 more quick questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So second to last question is around ballot access.
Mm-hmm.
What has happened to a lot of Yang Gang candidates for Congress, and this is within the Democratic Party, is oftentimes they meet a lot of challenges for getting on the ballot because they aren't generally the party favorites. They're a little bit outsiders, these kind of crazy guys asking for basic income and all these new ideas. And that's within the Democratic Party. I'm guessing running as an independent and trying to get on the ballot in November must be incredibly hard. What can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, it's a very challenging experience. The system we have set up is absolutely tailored not only to the 2-party system, but to white landowning men specifically. And so everything about this is meant to make it easier for the white landowning male and to make it easier for people running within the 2 parties. So every state has a different criteria of what you need to do to get on the ballot. Usually it's a signature collection. Some are as low as a few hundred, others are more than 100,000. Every state is different. Every state has a different timeline. Every state has different criteria of what you need to collect and who you can collect it from. So it's a logistical mess to figure all that out anyway. And we had been working on that since we ran. We were putting together a plan for how we wanted to begin collecting signatures beginning in February and March of this year. And then the global pandemic hit, and COVID-19, and it became impossible, not only impossible physically to go out and do it, but irresponsible to go out and do it in the midst of this pandemic. And so for 3.5 months, all of our signature collection halted. We weren't able to really do anything. And in several states, there was no option to do it. Now in the past, so every state has been, not every state, many states have been changing their criteria or changing some of the regulations. So a few states have opened up the ability to do remote signature collection. And so we've begun collecting signatures in states like Alaska, New Mexico, North Dakota, and New Hampshire, which allow remote collection. Now, what that means is they have to download the petition from our website, print it, sign it, put it in an envelope, and mail it to us. Now, for someone my age or older, 50 years or older, that's not a tough call. But for millennials and Gen Z who live in a virtual world that is not paper at all, that's like, it's a very hard job.
Use the mail system.
We actually did a video of training people how to stamp an envelope and how to mail it. But so that's made it challenging. Now we just started collecting this week. Illinois, who they used to have a signature threshold of 25,000 signatures, and because of the pandemic, they reduced it to 10%. So it's now 2,500 signatures, and we can collect the signatures remotely. So people can go to our website. If they're registered to vote in the state of Illinois, they can pull up the form. It takes a minute to pull up the form from our ballot access webpage, click on the state of Illinois, get the electronic signature form, and fill it out, and we have it. And it makes the process so much simpler. There's a few states that let us just pay fees. So we're raising money right now to get on the ballot in Colorado, which has a $1,000 fee, Louisiana, which has a $500 fee, and Oklahoma, which has a $35,000 fee. So we're raising money to get on the ballot in those states.
5,000.
35,000, yeah. And then there's some states like Vermont. So Vermont took away their signature requirement altogether. All you have to do is file with the state to get on the ballot. So we will get on the ballot in Vermont, and then there's several states like New York that legally halted all signature collection, and they have not issued any new guidance yet about what we can do to collect signatures in the state of New York. So we just hired a ballot access coordinator at the national level last week. We're a small campaign. We've been growing, especially in the past month or two. We've had some of our best fundraising this month in June, and so we've been able to add some new staff. So we have someone on board who's working specifically on ballot access and trying to get a handle on what is changing in all 50 states and what do we need to do to get on the ballot in those states. And so the states where we won't be able to meet the signature threshold, we're looking at, can we get write-in ballot access? Can people write my name in instead of having the name printed on the ballot? We're looking at all the options right now, but the pandemic, well, it was a mess beforehand, but now with the pandemic, it's made it even more confusing. And so we're doing our best to stay on top of it with our campaign.
Do you think you'll be able to get into the debates?
So the debates are kind of a guarded, sacred ground for the two-party system. And they make it very difficult for any third party or independent candidate to get on the debate. I believe a lot of it is based on polling. And so, first of all, we'll have to get on the ballot in enough states so we can actually be a national candidate. And then we'll need to be polling at a level high enough to, to show up on the radar of the two-party system. I would love to be in the debates. I think it would be great that if we get there. It's a heavily protected fortress.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, even Yang was getting blocked out of the Democratic debate, and that's within the party system.
And that was within the party system. And, the Democratic Party that had the most diverse group of candidates ever. By the time the first debate rolled around, I think Andrew Yang was the only person left on the debate stage, and he was removed shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, they were changing the rules so that someone like Michael Bloomberg could get on the debate stage. Again, the whole system is designed for white landowning men. And so, the whole system is designed for a certain demographic and to work a certain way. And if you try to go at it from any way outside of that, it is going to put up challenges and roadblocks.
Mark, I have to ask you, knowing the history as well as you do, how do you seem very optimistic and positive? How are you? Do you ever get like, if I were in your shoes, I might get very angry, and I might feel like, people stole my people's land. They profited from it. They are now destroying it, and they're oppressing a lot of my brothers and sisters. Like, F them. But you seem very positive and constructive. How do you do that?
Well, a lot of that has been very intentional, where I've been working very hard to work through even my own emotions around this. And this is not to say in any way that this history does not make me angry, or it's not, it hasn't had an impact on me. It absolutely has. I have worked very hard to try and figure out, how do we still have vision in the midst of this? And living on the reservation, when I was there, I'll share two stories with you very briefly. I was on the reservation, and I was living in a very remote section of our reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road, no running water, no electricity. Lived on a sheep camp. And I was actually able to do some consulting work. This was back in the early 2000s. I found if I hung my cell phone from the ceiling of my Hogan and charged my batteries in my car, I could get online at 28x speed for about 3.5 hours. And so that's where my username on most social media is Wireless Hogan, because I had a wireless network in my wireless Hogan That was off the grid back in early 2003, 2004. But so we lived there, and I was dealing with the marginalization, the oppression, the historical trauma. I was seeing more of the history more clearly for the first time in my life. And I was really wrestling with the injustice and how it was making me feel insecure, and it was just getting me very angry. And I was trying to process through this, and I was articulating to some friends of mine who weren't Native and weren't living on the reservation. I was trying to get them to understand how it felt. And in a letter I was writing, an actual snail mail letter I was writing from this Hogan, I said, being Native American and living on an Indian reservation in the middle of this country, it feels like our Native peoples are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they violently locked us upstairs in a bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to the bedroom, but it's much later, and we're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. When I wrote that, I was like, that's it. That's what I'm feeling. I began sharing that with people, and they said, you're articulating something that has been hard to articulate for a long time. I began sharing that with non-natives, and they would come to me instead of getting angry and defensive, and they would say, what does it look like to say thank you? How do we express gratitude to the host people of the land? And I think what it does is it reframes the dialogue from this discussion on victim versus oppressor, and it reframes it into what I would call this reversal of roles, where we have this nation comprised majority of undocumented immigrants, people who've never asked for, nor have they been given permission by the indigenous peoples of this land to be here. And they act like they own the place. And then you have this indigenous population that's been pushed aside to reservations and marginalized and treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. And a big part of what I'm trying to do is reverse these roles. I want this nation to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone's house. And I want our indigenous people to understand in some real and practical ways we are the host people of the land. And what does it mean for us to step into our role as the host? The other thing that highly motivates me is a quote by a native elder up in the lands now known as Canada. His name is George Erasmus. He's Dene from the tribes up in Canada. And when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in Canada just a few years ago, he used a quote that said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, you have to start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it's genius, and it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we do not have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers this mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have marginalized communities, Native Americans, African Americans, other peoples of color, who have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of boarding schools and Indian massacres, of internment camps and segregation, of Japanese exclusion or Chinese exclusion acts and families being ripped apart at our borders. And there's no common memory. And this helps us understand why there has never been healthy community in the United States across racial lines. And so part of my work is I'm not trying to shame white people. I'm not trying to give them a taste of their own medicine. I absolutely am trying to decenter them. Now that may feel oppressive to them because when you're used to being in the center, being treated as average like everyone else feels oppressive even though it's not. but I'm not trying to oppress them. I'm trying to decenter them so that we can create this common memory, understand the history we're actually standing on, and maybe have a healthier community. And this is really gets to the heart of what I'm doing with this campaign. When I am trying to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people truly means all the people, I think that would give us an incredible opportunity to have healthier relationships and to have a healthier community than we've ever had in this nation throughout our entire history. And that's what gives me hope. That's what gives me motivation. That's what makes me wake up every morning and continue to work on this campaign. On my campaign webpage, markcharles2020.com, a year ago, when I announced my campaign in May 28th of 2019, over a year ago, I released a 9-minute video on my social media. That video is on our website. And I lay out this vision of creating this common memory, of building this nation where we the people means all the people, of dealing with our systemic racism, sexism, and white supremacy, not to shame people, but to create common memory. And to this day, that video is one of the best campaign tools our campaign has developed. To this day, a year, 13 months later, I get emails and messages from people, sometimes in tears, saying, I've watched your video and it gives me so much hope. It makes me actually proud to be a part of this process and to want to engage with this. And they say, how can we have never heard you before? Like, why? How have you been in this race for a year and we've never heard your name, or you've never made it across our radar? But I encourage everyone I can. I said, give me 9 minutes. That's all I need. Give me 9 minutes. Go to our campaign website, watch our video, and make a decision. Do you want to live in a nation where we the people means all the people? And if you do, join us and help us begin the work on the foundations so we can get to these other places where this discussion has centered for so long. But to get there, we have to deal with the foundations first.
And for those who are listening and saying, hey, I like this guy, I wanna support this guy's candidacy, how can people be helpful?
So right now, one of our biggest things is the media has literally ignored me. Literally. Like, they've written me out of stories of events I've attended at. They've blatantly ignored our campaign. The media has made the intentional decision of not covering our campaign. And so the biggest way that we are trying to reach people is through social media. We are active on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. We're actually getting our TikTok account going this week. And so we are very actively reaching out to people on social media. We have our website where we are introducing our policies. I just laid out our 100-day plan last week. I'm talking about the ERA and sexism this week. Next week, going into the 4th of July, again, this document that calls Native savages. We are looking at some of the legal precedent for land titles. We'll be talking about all of the other issues, healthcare and criminal justice reform and foreign policy, education. All these things will be coming up in the coming weeks on our website. And so, yeah, we are asking people to share us. The biggest way we're getting news out there about us is word of mouth and people sharing us on their social media. Not kind of these blanket, just post something at random, but something that's contextual, something that say, hey, I saw this video, it really hit me, watch this and think about it, or hey, here's this policy that Mark's talked about. I've laid out my thinking on a lot of stuff on our YouTube channel, and people can go back and find those videos and, hey, here's this video Mark's talking about, his stance on abortion and what he's going to do with the dialogue that's happening around abortion, around the Second Amendment and gun control. And he's thinking about it in some very new and fresh ways. And so we're asking people to share our campaign, but to share it in a very contextual and in a very personal way, so that people, almost to endorse it, so that people will more likely read it, will more likely take a look at us. And again, if people watch our video, 9 times out of 10, that helps get them on board. And they find that there's actually some hope here. You know, right now the Democratic Party is struggling deeply because they literally took their least visionary and least compelling and least motivational person on the entire primary stage, and they made him their nominee. Everyone else who had these fresh ideas and these great perspectives and ideas they were bringing to the table, they've moved off the stage and they went with the white landowning male from the 1%. And so there's a lot of people who are feeling wanting more than the Democratic Party is willing to give them. And when they take a look at our campaign, if they can get past the binary of the two-party system and allow themselves to imagine that we actually might be able to bring this to the forefront, they'll find our campaign is full of vision, full of hope, and actually has some very doable plans of how we can begin making changes here. So I encourage people, go to our website, donate to us, sign up for our email list, share our resources, and continue walking with us. There's 6 more months left in this campaign. And as we've already seen in the past year, a lot can happen. You know, things can change overnight, as we've seen happen numerous times throughout this campaign.
Turtle Island may never be the same in the next few months. Who knows? But I applaud what you're doing, Mark. And I must also compliment your web design team. The website is really nice. So for those who are interested in checking out Mark's policies, markcharles2020.com. Check out the video there. There's a policy section. There's a ballot access session. It's really, clearly you have worked around technology in the past, and it shows well.
we have a great team of people we're a small team, but a great team of the people who put together our website, who put together our video.
Yeah, it's really nicely done.
I've done a tremendous job. I'm so proud of our entire team. I could not have gotten this far without them. So I'm deeply grateful for that.
And who knows? I look forward to seeing Andrew Yang in your cabinet if you make it to the Oval.
I would, he's one of the people I'd love to have a conversation with at some point. I would love to be able to sit down and talk with him because I like the way he thinks outside the box. And that's the type of thinking we need. We don't need more of the same, which is what we're getting right now. We need fresh, new ideas. And I think Andrew Yang, again, is at the top of my list of people I would love to engage with some of the stuff I'm trying to do and get his ideas for what he can bring into this campaign and into this administration.
Well, I'll definitely. I'm not super close with him, but I do chat with their team from time to time. So I'll let them know that they should check out Mark Charles. Maybe for the Yang Speaks podcast, you could be a guest, and you guys.
I would love that. I would love that.
All right, I'll keep my fingers crossed. I'll nominate you. I don't know. I'm sure they have a long list of people they want to talk to, but I think it would be a great conversation. And I want to thank you, Mark, for spending time with me. I also want to personally thank you. In your analogy, my family immigrated to the U.S. in the around 1970. And I've always been grateful for the opportunities that my family has had in America. I've never had an opportunity to thank a Native American person, for the land that the modern America is built on. And so I do want to go upstairs to that room and say, hey, thank you for allowing me, the opportunities I've had. And I've learned a lot from this conversation. I plan to learn more.
One of the things I encourage people to do, there's a great website out there that I use frequently to start my research of whose land am I visiting or whose land am I on. It's native-land.ca. And it's a really good resource. You can type in your city, your state, your zip code, anywhere in North America, and it will tell you what nation, what tribe was there traditionally, what languages were spoken in the area, what treaties were signed in that area. I encourage all Americans to learn whose land are you living on. Not just Native Americans' land in general, but what tribe was from the land where you reside. And then I encourage people to begin building relationship with that nation. Not as an educational experience or not just as some kind of token thing, but to really try to build a true relationship with the people whose land you're living on. And that is a great way to start the process of, as the metaphor says, coming up into the room and acknowledging, yeah, I want to get to know the people whose land I'm living on.
Well, hopefully we can make this land work for all of us and improve everybody's kind of outcomes and sustainability, and we can all live in more harmony than we certainly are now. Yeah. And I'm glad you're part of the conversation. And if anybody's watching this and you find it interesting, please check out Mark at markcharles2020.com. Please like and share this video, because I think Mark has some real nuggets in there that certainly were thought-provoking for me, and I think they'll be for your friends if you want to share it out. So with that, I will say goodbye, those who are called nerds.
Hakonet nerds, yes. So it's been great to be on with you. And Hakonet doesn't mean goodbye, it means we'll see you later. So Hakonet nerds, it's been great to be with you today.
I love it.